Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the fourth of 5 installments of Projecting Fellows, running weekly through February 2nd. We, Kyle Schumann and Katie MacDonald, will begin with a brief overview before handing the reins to this evening's moderators. Please note that the session is being recorded. Information on participants, upcoming events, and video from past events can be found on the event website at projectingfellows.com. We want to express our continued gratitude to the moderators and fellows who have made this series possible, and to the University of Virginia School of Architecture for virtually hosting the series, and to Dean Isla Berman and Chair of Architecture Felipe Correa, who joins us this evening, for their support, to Sneha Patel and Darcy Engel for facilitating the series, Chris Coate for art direction and graphic design, Wei Hao Wang for website design, and Jason Young for taking a chance on the two of us as co-fellows.
Several architecture schools nationwide annually name fellows to develop an intensive research or teaching project during a short-term appointment. The fellowship offers some combination of project support, cross-pollination between research and teaching, and a platform with which to present work. Selected via national searches, fellowship work is a projection of both emerging interests and institutional agendas. This January and February, the 2019 to 2020 class of fellows, some of whom have completed their fellowships while others are still in progress, convene to explore rising tides and the vehicle of the fellowship project. This series serves three audiences: the fellows, who might find a dispersed collectivity, an emerging generation of aspiring scholars and architects who might learn about the fellowship as a kind of incubator, and the broader architecture community, who might converge across geographic, institutional, and ideological boundaries.
This evening will consist of 4 presentations by fellows, followed by moderated discussion. We encourage audience participation by using the chat to pose questions and observations throughout the evening, and moderators may call in questions from the audience as well later tonight. In the first 3 events, discussion of fellowship work has centered on a wide range of topics, and important questions about the structure and role of fellowships have been raised. Tonight, the conversation will continue with a session themed Infrastructures and Ecologies, and we are honored to introduce tonight's moderators. Please join me in welcoming Neeraj Bhatia, whose work resides at the intersection of politics, infrastructure, and urbanism. He is Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Urban Works Agency at the California College of the Arts, Co-Director of InfraNet Lab, a nonprofit research collective probing the spatial byproducts of contemporary resource logistics, and the founder of the Open Workshop, a design office examining the project of plurality. Bhatia formerly held the Wortham Fellowship at Rice University and has received Graham Foundation grants, the Lawrence B. Anderson Award, the Shell Center for Sustainability Grant, and an ACSA Faculty Design Award, among others. He is co-editor of The Petropolis of Tomorrow, Bracket, Atrium, Weather and Architecture, and co-author of Pamphlet Architecture 30, Coupling, Strategies for Infrastructural Opportunism. Bhatia received a master's degree in architecture and urban design from MIT, where he was studying on a Fulbright fellowship, and holds a Bachelor of Environmental Studies and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Waterloo.
It is a pleasure to introduce Felipe Correa, an advocate for design's role as a critical mediator between society and space. He is the Vincent and Eleanor Shea Professor and the Chair of Architecture at the UVA School of Architecture, and founder and managing partner of Somatic Collaborative, a practice which works at the confluence of architecture, urbanism, and infrastructure. Prior to joining UVA, he was an associate professor and director of the Master of Architecture in Urban Design program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is also co-director of the South America Project, a transcontinental applied research network that proactively endorses the role of design within rapidly transforming geographies, and the author of such titles as Beyond the City, Resource Extraction, Urbanism in South America, Mexico City, Between Geometry and Geography, A Line in the Andes, and Sao Paulo, A Graphic Biography. Correa holds a Master of Architecture in Urban Design from Harvard and a Bachelor of Architecture from Tulane. Neeraj and Felipe, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you guys so much. I'm going to introduce our first presenter tonight to get the ball rolling. Felipe and I will go back and forth, but thank you, Katie and Kyle, for the invitation and for putting this program together. I really wish something like this happened when I was a fellow. And I'm really happy to do this with Felipe because I met Felipe So our first presenter today is, can you guys hear me okay? I just got an internet unstable.
We lost you for a second, but we're glad.
Okay. Okay, I'll jump into introducing our first presenter, Priyanka Bista. Priyanka was the 2019-2020 Design for Spatial Justice Fellow at the University of Oregon and is co-founder of KTK Belt Studio. Bista holds a Bachelor of Architectural Science from Ryerson University and a Master's of Art in International Architectural Regeneration and Development from Oxford Brookes University. Priyanka, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Neeraj, Kyle, and Katie for hosting this event. Are you able to hear me fine? Good, okay. All right, so today I'll just present to you about the fellowship as well as the project that I'm currently working on called the Vertical University. I'm the co-founder and design director of a project called the Vertical University, located in eastern region of Nepal across an 8,000-meter vertical gradient that spans from the 67-meter elevation all the way in the low flat plains all the way to the highest Himalayas, 8,586 meters. And in 2019, I was selected to be one of the 6 inaugural cohort of the Design for Spatial Justice initiative at the University of Oregon. And as a part of my fellowship, I was given the opportunity to bring the Vertical University project into a studio setting and to shape a studio around designing in Koshitapu, which was the base of this entire project, also a region where about 526 bird species or 5% of all birds either live in or migrate through. The duration of my fellowship was only for 1 term, which is 2.5 months and 11 weeks to be precise. So quite intense. So I thought, you know, what better way to jumpstart the term other than asking a cohort of Masters of Architecture students about what is it like being a bird? How would you smell, touch, see, feel, navigate through space if you are a bird? Of course, this is not a new question nor an inquiry. Many philosophers, wildlife biologists, and even designers have been pursuing this question. For example, here's an example of Thomas Twaits, who explored what it's like being a goat for 3 days exactly by using prosthetics to be able to walk on all 4 legs, and who documented this very uncomfortable experience in a book. And more seriously, a biologist, Tim Burkhead, gives an insight on what it's like being a bird as he writes in great detail about the multitude of ways in which birds use their senses to interpret and interact with their environments, such as the ways in which a great gray owl hunts using their extraordinary and acute hearing that pinpoints the source of sound in both the horizontal and the vertical plane. Although initially stumped, the students really started to explore, imagine, and learn about the different senses of the 12 selected endangered birds of Koshitapu. And now I threw in another question. As space makers, builders, and designers, how do we take this information and translate it into architecture? Is that even possible? The responses ranged from designing of trails that mimicked the life cycle and movement patterns of bristle grassbird, to viewing platforms that give space for carcass-eating endangered Egyptian vultures, to olfactory towers with scent pods dedicated to scavenger birds such as the locally extinct greater adjutant, to developing a series of structures where you could learn experientially about the many ways in which a yellow-breasted bunting, a migratory bird that's undergoing 90% population decline, gets trapped in their wintering grounds, gets sold as gourmet delicacies in China, or gets caught and sold as souvenirs in Cambodia, in temples of Cambodia. So really, the goal of this exercise was not particularly to become a bird, but to understand the many ways in which birds exist, their struggles, and perhaps even develop some solutions. I posed the same question to a group of interdisciplinary participants in a conference and workshop in Goa, resulting in equally and innovative and interesting solutions. And I posed the same questions to young people living in Koshitapu. The responses perhaps were not as creative, not well rendered, but the concern was very real. How did I not know about the bird that's facing 90% decline that lives in my own village? How can we stop this from happening? Can we do the same exercise with poachers? Can we ask them to become birds? My effort, I guess, if you can summarize, for the last 6 years has been just this. Through design, through playful exercise, through any means possible, create a space where humans can become more empathetic towards their non-human counterparts. So it's not news that we've entered the Anthropocene, an era that's drastically dominated by humans. This is also an era that's witnessing the greatest biodiversity loss since the dinosaur era some 65 million years ago. Nepal, a country located in the Asian subcontinent, is not an exception. If you look at the map of Nepal, it's essentially a rectangular block. And if you cut across the south to north cross section, you get a profile that rises from sea level all the way to the highest Himalayas within just a short distance of 100 to 150 kilometers. Although only 0.09% of landmass of the Earth, this complex terrain has resulted in diversity of all kinds, both humans and non-humans. However, propelled by macro level global changes, Nepal is trying to reposition itself as a transit state between India and China. Just between 2000 and 2010, the network of road infrastructure actually expanded by 50%. And in around the same duration, Nepal lost about 25% of its total forest cover, approximately 1.2 million hectares of forest. However, as devastating or as you know, doom and gloom, all of these narratives seemed, the reason why this project actually came up was because there were passionate individuals that we met across this entire belt who, oddly enough, were just as passionate, if not more, about conserving their own landscape and their biodiversity. And so we carved the trails and our nodes around these individuals and communities that were interested in conservation. And collectively, we developed a map of a north-south corridor. I think it's a very biased map that focused on biodiversity as opposed to roads. So finally, I just want to end by talking about the final project of the studio, the design of learning centers in Koshitapu, the same region where which hosts 5% of all world's birds, and one of the most critical staging and wintering grounds for global populations of wetland birds in the Central Asian flyway. Like other parts of Nepal, however, the forest cover in Koshitapu just within the last 30 years has dropped by 94%. Much of this we started realizing is not only because of urbanization, but also because of overgrazing, as large herds of uncontrolled cattle have crossed over from the buffer zone into the reserve. The issue has been one of the central reasons for the decline of the bird habitats. And so in developing the design of the learning centers in Koshitapu, one team completely and utterly focused on the problem of the 10,000 feral cattle. The students examined how the cattle, essentially an invasive species of its kind, could generate energy, a process that resulted in developing speculative designs for a learning center that's focused on alternative energy sources. Another team developed a center focused on scavenger birds, where people needed to crouch down and crawl into a glass box to be at the eye level of a scavenger bird. Another team responded to the problem of the ongoing flooding of the region, and by developing an infrastructure that operated as both a refuge to humans and non-humans during flood period. And since I've been, sorry for this, since I've been back to Nepal, we've actually moved ahead with the restoration of a 6.7 hectares of land, one of the land parcels that we explored. And despite the pandemic, with the leadership of our local community members and team members, young fellows, we've been able to restore this land parcel. And I'm happy to say that migratory birds have started to arrive already. Just in the last month, over 100 species of birds have been recorded in this particular parcel. I get emails almost every week saying the rare falcated duck has been spotted. And of course, I have to look into what a falcated duck is and why everyone's really excited about it. And so over the course of the last 6 or so years, what I've learned is that if you provide a space and a support structure, we can engage the energies and curiosities of young people, whether they're from Oregon or Koshitapu, to steward conservation efforts. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Priyanka. We will continue now with the second presentation, but before I introduce José, I do want to do a quick shout out to Katie and Kyle. This is the first time that I'm live in one of these events, even though I follow them closely. And I have to say, when Katie and Kyle said that they wanted to host this at UVA and if I would be willing to support it, I was like, I am absolutely delighted. This is exactly the kind of events that we should be doing. I think sort of academia, beyond sort of the production of knowledge, has an incredible ability to bring people together and to set forth conversations that otherwise they would never happen. And I think this project exemplifies that and is not only very smart, but very collegial. So I wanted to say that before I continue with my role as a moderator. So I am delighted to introduce the second speaker, who of course is not a stranger to UVA. José Ibarra was the 2019-2020 Urban Edge Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And Ibarra is currently an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. And of course, we're very, very lucky and happy to have him here. José's work sits at the intersection of architecture, urbanism, and environmental uncertainty, with projects that examine time and cyclical issues within the life of buildings and cities. He is the co-editor of a forthcoming volume titled Werewolf, The Architecture of Lunacy, Shape-Shifting, and Material Metamorphosis. And at UVA, he is currently reconceptualizing, along with Maria Gonzalez, the undergraduate housing studio. Ibarra holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University and a Master of Architecture from Princeton University. And I'm very much looking forward to his presentation and very happy to have him here. José, welcome.
Thank you so much, Felipe, for that wonderful introduction. Can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just putting it full screen now. Can everyone see it full screen? Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, so thanks, Felipe, again, and many thanks to Katie and Kyle for organizing this symposium, to Neeraj, Bhatia, and Felipe Correa for moderating it. Thank you also to my fellow fellows for sharing their work today, and all those in the audience who are listening. I also, of course, want to thank the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee for the opportunity to join the school during the 2019-2020 academic year, especially to chair Moselle, the search committee that decided to hire me, as well as all the wonderful faculty colleagues, staff, and students that I got to work with closely. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank the University of Virginia School of Architecture for hosting this series, as well as for taking a chance and hiring not one, but 3 fellows as assistant professors at the school this year. Thanks to Dean Ayla Berman, Chair Felipe Correa, and again, all the faculty, staff, and students that were involved in all of these decisions. The University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee offers 1-year fellowships focused in design instruction and architectural research. Broadly, fellows are in charge of energizing the architectural curriculum and presenting their work at the end of the year, which I did with a 3-hour-long virtual exhibition seen here. My research focused on developing critical methods for assessing and dealing with urban traumas, specifically ecological and social unrest. Tonight, I will present excerpts of an essay I wrote as a culmination of my fellowship year, whose publication is forthcoming in the Cornell Journal of Architecture. The essay is titled Architecture After the End, a Call for Geoempathy, and it is a text that looks at the Earth as the physical and metaphorical ground for architecture in the Anthropocene. Then I'll show some student and personal work to demonstrate that the intersection between architecture and environment is not a thin line, but a space held wide open for interaction and interpretation. The end of the world occurred in April 1784, says Timothy Morton, when James Watt patented the steam engine, an act that commenced the depositing of carbon in Earth's crust. On its own, the concept of the end seems definitive and inflexible. However, an end is defined as an area that lies at the boundary of something, an extreme, and a turn of event. This moment after can be generative and productive, prompting a rethinking and restructuring of anything which was once known. For Morton, the end is linked to hyperobjects, which are things, beings, and concepts that are massively distributed in time and space and which transcend specificity. My research proposes that architecture in the Anthropocene respond to massive scales and temporalities, remodeling itself after geological processes and considering living and non-living beings on our planet to be another hyperobject. Architecture has for too long modeled itself after biological beings and their behavior. Consider here the innumerable variations for which the image of man has served to center the discipline. This has contributed to an exclusionary outlook that has marginalized people from conversations that have shaped the world, literally and figuratively. What is surprising is that as technology and capital advance at unprecedented rates, humans live longer and buildings die faster and sooner. Meanwhile, the ecological disaster to which this wasteful practice has contributed also harms to a greater extent those which it has excluded. In 2011, several architects looked at geology in an attempt to slow the field down and substitute the horizontal for the vertical. Landform building arose as a series of provocations that looked at architecture, landscape, and urbanism in order to synthesize buildings with nature by swapping the biological with the geological. However, the promise of this turn to landscape has been limited by a predominant focus on artifice and form. Even when buildings began to perform more like landscape, a clear disconnect still existed between the architecture's exploitation of the site, its degree of completion, and its ability to endure or change through time. Architecture requires large systemic changes to stay relevant in a changing world. Arguing for balance, I propose the term geoempathy as a concept that could help the field mend its human and non-human transgressions. This new term encompasses geontological empathy, a process through which all life and non-life become constituencies in the design of the world. Geoempathy is a design of process which yields new objects that respond to and interact with other things in the world. This mode of designing shares many of the concerns of ecological work in architecture, for which the well-being of other organisms is equated against an object. A fundamental difference is the embedding of planned obsolescence into architecture, which would foresee changes in the form, function, performance, and users of the very objects that arise from this process. Now, if biological beings and processes have shaped our discipline, an important shift here is to use geological formations instead to guide the work of our generation. Geological formations work in a continuum and involve the reuse and recycle of the same geological matter that concocts them, along with other accumulated substances. One early example of this is the Grand Canyon system, which has seen innumerable formal, programmatic, and performative configurations throughout its long history of folding and metamorphism, shown here on the right. Sometimes an ocean, other times a mountain, and today a steep-sided gorge, humanity has only been a part of a tiny fraction in a series of events that make up the impressive Grand Canyon. Consider instead how fixed architecture's intentions tend to be, or how unambiguous our disregard for the ground is. Buildings are usually understood first as isolated objects, and then as objects on a site, objects with users, and so on. Moving away from architecture's fixed and static formal explorations and instead thinking through the design of processes can have important consequences in our discipline and practice. And yet, buildings that encompass multiple configurations, states, users, and uses might not just be an idea for the future, but a necessity for our present survival. Geological formations are productive for their lessons on process, but they can also be generative in their approach to form making. Consider, for instance, the process of fossilization. Fossils occur when organic matter hardens into stone, whereby the organisms themselves tend to get dissolved and their absence leaves behind a spatial trail akin to a mold. In this case, form itself adapts to and is adapted by its context and users. This formal change also occurs accidentally. The organisms themselves never intended to be fossilized. On the left here, we see that the inherent logic of an organism's shape has dictated the formal qualities of a first mold. On the right, we see that the disturbances of the ground and other geological process can change the formal qualities of a mold until it becomes unrecognizable from its original organism, in this case, a trilobite. The accident arrived in architecture through Bernard Tschumi's provocation that there is no architecture without event. Architecture cannot merely be abstracted to its physical manifestation. It comprises form and performance, object and operation, organism and mold. And yet, in most cases, thinking of event without seeing the architectural product as a process has fixed buildings to singular functions, which again results in stasis and reduces architecture's flexibility and agility over time. Perhaps as architects, we already expect contingency in our work as we deal with volatile clients, contractors, and even material or structural failure. The questions remain, how do we design for uncertainty? And how can architecture adapt and change with an ever-shifting context? These were some of the main ideas and questions that occupied my year as a fellow. Many of the topics that are outlined in this text were taken up individually and explored throughout the many courses, public programs, and design projects that I led and produced over the course of the fellowship. These explorations included an upside-down picnic and conversation with Jennifer Bonner, where we talked about materials, colors, glitter, food, and of course, roofs. A panel about pedagogy and climate crisis at the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. A Model United Nations Convention around the politics of sand, along with coursework, such as the first MArch Foundation Studio, which I coordinated and taught, and where students learned about the conventions of drawing and the principles of design while still tackling ecological theories, non-human users, and more. Or a design theory seminar that looked at global environmental crises against the backdrop of psychoanalysis, perceptual psychology, ecology, biology, and architecture, and an advanced architectural studio that asks students to design a single architectural proposition through a series of projects ranging in duration, from a few seconds to several years and deep time. These projects occupy different sites and oscillated between speculation, artifice, exaggeration, and optimism to develop ideas and design solutions to real-world problems without the limitations of what already exists. For instance, these students found that the ground in New Ixit, Alaska was melting and that the Inupiat people were being displaced by economic pressures. The project burrows deep into the permafrost and bedrock, building a cave-like cellar that grows into an immense underground city over the course of centuries by appropriating abandoned infrastructures and using dead animal bones as building material. While these other students looked at the Peruvian Amazon, which has undergone significant decay due to an exploitation of gold extraction. Unidad attaches itself to a host mining pit through a modular bamboo space frame which extends the landscape. The community comes together and uses their knowledge of indigenous weaving practice to create a new architectural and economic model for the region that will last thousands of years and blend with nature. And of course, many other projects were developed by students and myself, which address several of the concerns mentioned today. In particular, I'd like to end with Casa Acamba, a project that earned my collaborators and me an honorable mention in the Premio Felix Candela competition. The project is a cultural center that celebrates the multiple uses of agave and their associated indigenous rituals. This is done through a complex that helps remedy soil issues, prevents erosion, and educates human users about the plant. At the human scale, the architecture is a series of space-defining interventions sculpted from the ground itself, with a circular steel canopy hanging above the earth and held by the same landscape upon which it lies. At the ecosystem scale, the architecture harnesses agave as a healing medium, using its own production rituals and byproducts to cure the soil, while creating space for multiple species to coexist together. Today, we need not fear the end of the world, for the end has already happened. This moment after requires reflection and prompts us to look beyond the biological boundaries of existence. If geological models tell us anything about ourselves, it is that we have been enmeshed with life and known life since the beginning of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose, for that fantastic presentation and a really amazing diversity of work and formats. I really appreciate that. Our last or second last presenter tonight is Zannah Matson. Zannah was the 2019-2020 Design for Spatial Justice Fellow at the University of Oregon. Matson is currently an assistant teaching professor at the Pennsylvania State University and also a PhD candidate in human geography at the University of Toronto. Matson holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Toronto and a Master of Landscape Architecture from Harvard University.
Thanks so much. Wonderful. I'm gonna just, share the screen. There we are. Can you all see that okay? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And really just to start off, wanting to thank Katie and Kyle for all of the work you've done kind of putting together this series of sessions. It's really such a wonderful project. And it's great to see everyone's work, and I'm looking forward to the discussion together after. So I am Zannah Matson, and like Priyanka, who gave such a wonderful introduction to the University of Oregon program, I was one of 6 2019 to 2020 University of Oregon Design for Spatial Justice Fellows. But I was specifically in the Department of Landscape Architecture in the School of Architecture and Environment on the Eugene campus. And I see lots of folks from that campus and from the department here tonight. So it's lovely to see you all virtually again. I'll just change this. So I'm now, as Neeraj said, assistant teaching professor at Penn State in the Department of Landscape Architecture. And so for me, the Design for Spatial Justice Fellowship was very much oriented around teaching. I taught 5 courses while there, studios, seminars, lecture classes over a 9-month position. And this kind of super brief presentation, I thought I would try to connect what I see as the kind of 3 central themes of my larger body of design and scholarship with some of the work from classes and studios to reflect a little bit on the relationship between my own critical work on marginalization, racialization, and colonialism, and efforts to incorporate spatial justice into design pedagogy. I think that it's an interesting kind of conversation as well when thinking about the role of the Fellows program and the role of the Fellows in kind of thinking through pedagogy as well within design schools. So these are the 3 themes that I'm going to be talking about, and I'll move right into the first one, which is contestation and resistance in infrastructural space. So to the east of the easternmost ridge of the Colombian Andes is a highway known as La Carretera Marginal de la Selva. It translates into the highway at the edge of the jungle. You can just see it there in yellow. Although the construction of the project is halted for now, if ever completed, which is debatable and I would say highly unlikely, the highway will stretch from Venezuela to Ecuador across Colombia's eastern territories. While the state often presents the highway to citizens and perhaps more importantly to foreign investors to highlight its potentials for economic integration, the highway's existence has been justified politically to consolidate state control in regions of the country long considered quote unquote ungovernable. With the route that traverses the formerly demilitarized zone and the main FARC base, the construction of the Marginal de la Selva was part of a state strategy in the Eastern territories to gain control over land and mobilize it as a resource for economic production. The violence and displacement that have been tied to strategies of state control, like infrastructure construction, have disproportionately impacted the country's most marginalized. And in this case, it's largely indigenous people, but also Afro-Colombian populations and poor campesinos as well. So my research overall, and this is the kind of main part of my research project, it uncovers the historic development of infrastructure as a strategy of the built environment to control landscapes and the marginalized people that inhabit them, and how the material manifestations of highway infrastructure here specifically are implicated in more extensive constructions of race and landscapes of capital extraction and accumulation, typically in peripheral zones or los territorios nacionales, which is what the kind of era that I look at in Colombian history. So the approach of this research project became part of a seminar called Issues in Infrastructure that I taught in the winter 2020 term. It was an absolutely wonderful experience with a great group of students from all different disciplines and all different stages of their academic career. And in the class, the students focused their research on a specific infrastructure to understand the complex histories and politics of planning, construction, and resistance narratives that are woven into infrastructural space. This is the work of Chewang Temang, who focused his research on the proposed ring road in Kathmandu, Nepal, specifically seeking to understand the larger political context of this road as a manifestation of modern desires, as we often see in infrastructure, but also as a force of displacement. Carmela Sambo was looking at light rail in Honolulu to examine the longer colonial histories alongside projected futures of climate change and infrastructural futurity. And Isabella Espino Rodriguez was looking at the use of cable cars to connect this site that has an absolutely wild history, and she's working on her comp project on it right now, the Posada de la Maña in Quindio, Colombia. The attention to infrastructural landscapes that I focus on in my own research was also something I was further able to bring into a site design studio that I taught, working with a really entangled infrastructural site that students engage with, the ever-present kind of Oregon Coastal Highway that you're seeing in this middle image here that bifurcated the site, but also a number of the students worked with the longer infrastructural histories of the site as one of colonial extraction of resources from fishing to forestry, and now the proposed pipeline for the Jordan Cove LNG project. So you can see some of these explorations of site history here in Liza Holtz's work, and also in this project by Heather Tietz that was really looking to create spaces for protesting extractive industries because of this history of the site. Moving into the second theme, I know this is quick, but into kind of visual constructions of race and spatial injustice, and this is largely through landscape visuality. So in researching the ways that the landscapes that the Marginal de la Selva travels through, and this is a piece of the kind of quote unquote unfinished road, the kind of landscapes that this highway travels through are really impacted by the creation of infrastructural space, obviously materially, but also really symbolically in these regions. And so I've become deeply aware of how these landscapes themselves and the people that live in them have been portrayed by the state, and how these often visual constructions have embedded within them colonial ideologies. To explore this further, my work analyzes colonial post-independence landscape paintings that reified ecological conditions into geographic categorizations, and also affix racial classifications to the inhabitants of these landscapes. And so this work advances design scholarship kind of alongside a more of a cultural geography lens of research to understand the ways in which lineage of visual representation has been used as a method of colonial control over indigenous people. I'm also interested in how often these same representations and representational constructions are used in contemporary design work to construct spatial exclusion. And so this work very much kind of recognizes landscape architecture and architecture as visual as well as spatial disciplines to understand how the implicit biases of visuality are often reproduced to contribute to spatial inequity. So I was able to teach a lecture course on landscape visuality and coloniality, which was a really wonderful experience to work through some of these themes that too often get implicitly woven into our interpretations of landscape, and I would suggest subsequently design proposals. And the course was in spring 2020. So it actually became, unexpectedly became one of the ways to kind of process the racism and anti-Black violence happening around us. Thinking about how visual constructions of landscape have created spaces of exclusion and have reinforced justifications for state violence. And so these images are just some of the postcards that students submitted alongside, it was a kind of more critical theory class. So students submitted deconstructions of these often kind of colonial and racist tropes and narratives about place. And the class also worked to explore the possibilities of counter visualities like these ones here that show up in my research, that help us think through the potential of visual representations of landscape to challenge hegemonic ways of seeing and inspire design of more emancipatory spaces. And so finally, to look a little bit briefly at material ecologies and extractive politics, which we've heard about already, so there's lots of overlap happening already. This is the kind of third avenue of research for me. And this isn't one as specifically tied to my research on the Marginal de la Selva, but through my experiences researching in Colombia, I've become increasingly interested in the inequities and environmental injustice in these regional clay landscapes that have been shaped by the extraction of clay and these long histories of ceramic production and brick manufacturing. So in addition to the significance of materials to our design process, this is really kind of digging into how materials can be understood as part of more complex set of relations that connect to particular ecologies and cultural significance, but really how fundamentally they're embedded within systemic structures of power and domination, thinking here about extraction, dispossession, but also labor relations. So this theme has been part of my research agenda since my work designing the Canada Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2016 with OPSIS, and I've continued to work on extractive landscapes ever since. And the theme of this research was something that actually was able to work into both studios that I worked on. I just don't have time to walk through those studios, but it was more explicitly developed actually in a focus seminar called Unruly Materials, where students were able to explicitly deal with the politics and ecological considerations of a single material examined across scales. So kind of followed a similar method as the infrastructure class in some ways. Here, Irina Volanets examined different species that make up larger categorization of timber in the Pacific Northwest. Have to talk about timber. And here, Masayo Simon explored the histories and properties and contestations of Portland cement, the kind of protests happening around it, the ecological considerations. But this class was also in the spring of 2020, and so the possibilities of kind of future aggregate materials were explored here amid calls to defund the police. And these projects became a way of understanding how the materials of the built environment contribute to racial injustice, and also kind of thinking through the idea of emancipatory futures as well. So that's all I can pack into 10 minutes, or maybe more at this point, and I'll leave it there. But I really hope we can pick up some of these themes already, kind of recognizing there's lots of overlap with other folks. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Zannah, for a great presentation and a topic, of course, that's very close to my heart. So a lot of questions that will follow in a little bit. But before we get there, we have last but not least, our last presenter today, Galen Pardee. Galen Pardee is the 2019-2021 LeFevre Emerging Practitioner Fellow at The Ohio State University and founder of Drawing Agency. Galen's work offers a careful examination of how architecture and the architectural drawing specifically can help advance a more nuanced understanding of boundaries and borders, one that can account for the discrepancies between political jurisdictions and material flows, and propose more multifaceted and productive overlaps across adjacencies. I think his project, The Last Impervious Surface in Portage County, Ohio, is a point in case, and I suspect we'll hear about it today. I hope so. Pardee holds a Bachelor of Arts in Politics from Brandeis University and a Master's of Architecture from Columbia University. Galen, welcome to UVA.
Thank you. That's a very nice introduction. If I can get through this in time. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen over here? Okay, well, all right, so I better move quick. So first of all, yeah, thank you, Felipe, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, of course, to Kyle and Katie for organizing and then corralling all, like 25 of us or something. That's very impressive. Of course, I have to give my deepest thanks to Todd Gannon, the section head of the Knowlton School of Architecture, as well as the LeFevre committee that brought me there, as well as the whole OSU community that's been a really fantastic, inspiring home for the past 2 years, including fellows Galo Canizares and Zach Cohen, who presented in earlier sessions here. I'd also like to thank my two grad students who were completely irreplaceable across 2 exhibitions now, Melissa Fulzen-Logan and Anthony Salvaggio. Okay, so I want to the reason I want to move quick is I want to talk about two projects actually. So first I want to start with this one. This was a sort of project I arrived at the fellowship with. It's called Territories of Territory Extraction. It was supported as well by the Graham Foundation for Advanced Study of the Fine Arts. It's also been published in Plat, Factor, and a forthcoming issue of Threshold. So if this is too brief, look for it there. So basically, this was an exploration of Singapore's plans to expand its territory by 30% by 2030, a goal it's well on its way to doing. And the sort of mechanism, material mechanism, and the geopolitical mechanism by which it's chosen to do so. Materially speaking, of course, of sand. So this is actually now even out of date. But the question is sort of, how do we forensically dissect the cityscape of Singapore to arrive at something that maybe is not perhaps scientifically accurate, but is rather scalar, in-depth, and architectural. So meeting the city where it is as a sort of set of tools for itself. So I want to talk about one of those pathways in particular here. This is, again, sort of like grappling with scale and trying to think about architectural media. So this is a interpretation of a United Nations report from 2012. Basically, their findings were that if you took all of the construction aggregates used that year, you could sort of construct a wall 27 meters wide, 27 meters tall, that would wrap the Earth's equator. So this is it passing through Singapore. And then, so the project, the sort of mechanism I want to talk about here is specifically called Terraform Chronologies. And so this was done through site visits to Singapore, as well as kind of specially designed drawing machine that I'll touch on in a bit. But basically, this project sort of divides the southern and eastern coast of Singapore into 5 key zones, basically, individual mega projects that have either been completed or are still ongoing today, and sort of, tries to dive into why they're happening, and more importantly, when and from where they are happening. So this is a picture from one of these sites. As you can see, it's sort of obviously expanding, but again, you don't see too much from just a picture itself. And so I was really kind of inspired by this, and trying to sort of figure out what was there in the public realm to sort of shed more light on the situation. I actually turned to the Landsat system, which is a fascinating resource. It's a sort of reliable record over the past 30 years. Actually more, 30 years was relevant for this project. It's been around for longer than that. But the satellite system images the entire globe every 2 weeks. So there's a sort of steady stream of these kind of consistent satellite images, which are not only kind of like spectral data. So, you can use them for color, things like that. They're also dimensional. So each pixel in these images is actually 30 meters square. So you can sort of measure and place in time simultaneously. And then second of all, the sort of other public data source for sand is the United Nations. So this is a quick download of their Singapore's reported import figures for sand, running back to 1989. And so basically the story here is, as you can see, there's a very, very conflicted supply chain for sand, as I think probably both Zannah and José could attest to. I won't get into it now, but basically the upshot is Singapore has been forced to sort of expand and expand and expand its supply chain as its closest neighbors sever trade ties. And so when you combine those two data sets together, you get something like this. This is outputs of a drawing machine that I developed, which basically reads images and creates sort of topographic data. And so each of these colored dots represents a sort of different primary trading partner in that year. And then of course, the sort of resulting form is also color-coded similarly. So you start to see in overlay how this particular site, this is Tuas Megaport, how it's been developing throughout its construction. And then obviously if you get more granular and you start to break things down into sort of more significant chunks, certain patterns emerge. You start to sort of understand, maybe the rate of how these things are growing. Sometimes it's possible to see, the sort of emergence of a new trading partner. And so the basic output of this is, so each of these sites has a sort of completely compiled, 30 images, one on top of the other, version of itself in this archive. And so these run from Tuas, which is here on the left, so the largest megaport in the world when it's completed. Jurong in the center is a sort of petrochemical hub. It's an island that's been built basically only to produce petroleum byproducts. The old cargo terminal, the sort of famous Marina Bay, which most people probably know for Moshe Safdie's buildings, but is actually this kind of crazy like geoengineering project that created a giant rainwater reservoir in what used to be a saltwater bay. And then lastly, the sort of airport over on the far eastern coast. And so, the reason I wanted to talk about this first is because I really felt like I was getting a lot out of developing this project and the project I'm going to talk about next kind of in tandem with each other. And so, sort of looking at these questions like how to, expose and qualify architectural entanglements, what are the sort of geopolitics of material, how do these sort of political dimensions maybe distort or open up new possibilities for graphic conventions? And most importantly, I think for me is, how might this sort of exercise in, quantification and forensic research sort of lend itself to a kind of possible future architectural practice. So this is the Great Lakes Architectural Expedition. So building off of that, I knew when I got to OSU that I was not so concerned with the building itself so much as the form of the organization that did the building. So the Great Lakes Expedition is a kind of speculative public architecture office that I designed as the sort of primary output of my fellowship. The exhibition itself is a sort of kind of archive show of the office's work, but just to sort of lay out the terms here. So the expedition has its beginnings in the Great Lakes Compact, which is a 2008 law that basically creates a closed loop. You can't take water out of the Great Lakes Basin for private uses, essentially. Of course, the issue with that, as this slide here is trying to show, is that the geographical boundary of the Great Lakes does not match up with the political boundaries of our cities, counties, states, things of that nature. So the immediate impact was the case of Foxconn. I don't know if you guys paid attention to the Foxconn factory saga in Wisconsin. It's ongoing, it's shambolic, it's hilarious. But what is most critical is that they actually built their giant factory exactly on the dividing line. So half of it is in the Mississippi River watershed, the other half is in the Lake Michigan watershed. This is near Racine, Wisconsin. And basically they were able to do this because Foxconn's lawyers realized that the compact actually doesn't specify what a public use of water is in the first place. So essentially the factory was able to just say that it was a public use of water, even though it was clearly private, and that was enough to get the stamp of approval. And then so the last sort of, let's say, like instigating event here, the city of Toledo actually declared Lake Erie a person with kind of legal guardianship rights very briefly in 2019. Obviously it didn't last, but the goal was to pursue legal action against polluters from the sort of agricultural hinterlands in the Maumee River Basin that surrounds the city. And so taken together, I started to really think about, first of all, how might this, watershed boundary start to become a kind of new political boundary as well, or rather a more visible political boundary. It's already quite effective as a political boundary. And secondly, specifically responding to Foxconn, how might architects who are trained always to be thinking of the public and the sort of public face of our work, perhaps this sort of question mark next to what the public constitutes in this region might be a sort of, instigating event. And so, this was kind of the first drawing I made, which is cracking open the border, sort of considering this kind of transnational zone as a sort of new political, geographical entity that might need a public architect. So the show, as I said, it explores three projects from the expedition's early years. The first, the Parliament for a Material World. Second, the Maumee Basin Phosphorus Cooperative. And the last, Impervious Surface in Portage County, Ohio. So I'm gonna go through these real fast. So the Parliament for a Material World is the office's headquarters. This is located in downtown Toledo. And so again, I was very interested in sort of getting beyond what not so much that architects would become the sort of reorderers of the political good, but rather that they should first look inward at our own offices and our own practices and sort of really take seriously, what an office for an expanded architectural practice might look like and contain. So this has, classrooms with the idea that the architectural programs in Ohio would send their students here, a very large meeting room, which contains the sort of Great Lakes stand-in for a client, which I'll talk about in a second. And also, of course, multiple areas that are open to the public. This kind of free enfilade of these sort of like small public spaces for gathering and informal conversation. And so, again, the idea here is that the sort of, this is a model of it. This is the show that actually just opened at Kent, which if any of you are in Cleveland, please go see safely. So again, the idea is here to sort of like get at, expanding and transforming architectural work. So like, what are the sort of different kinds of architectural production that emerge? And so again, when I say the lake is the client, so I actually looked at in the Netherlands, there actually is a system where they've kind of bureaucratized their watersheds by basically creating a sort of second elected body of watershed representatives that you would vote for. And so the idea is that in order to get a sort of set of natural resources, like for instance, Lake Erie, as I mentioned, newly given personhood, they might get a seat at a table as a sort of kind of democratic entity. And then the architecture office could sort of more, easily interface with them, translate their kind of wills and desires into a framework that might either, again, create its own architectural projects or sort of set up a kind of mediating entity for a situation like Foxconn. So the Maumee Basin Phosphorus Co-op was an example of a project that the lake might ask for. So it started with this study of pollution around Toledo. And again, sort of thinking about like, what might be considered a finished product rather than research in an architecture office in the future. The sort of finished product here was this sort of chemical topography, basically substituting height fields for geographical features for concentrations of phosphorus in the sort of subbasins that all drain into the lake. And then the second part of this is the co-op itself, which is a series of these algal turf scrubbers, which are sort of lining the tributaries of the river out near where all the kind of industrial farming happens. So they're actually very simple. They're basically, if you have a fish tank, they're basically what you have, if you have an algal scrubber, you know what this is. Basically, each of these towers contains a half acre of mesh. That mesh holds photosynthetic algae. Runoff is kind of fed over those mesh screens. The algae eat any kind of suspended particulates. And then because the tower is open, the water can flow off the side. And then it's a cooperative because, of course, the algae being photosynthetic means they can also be a sort of source of carbon sequestration, in addition to removing the algae from Lake Erie, which is a source of drinking water for Cleveland, Toledo, any major city along its banks. And so finally, to end, I'd like to talk about the last impervious surface in Portage County, Ohio. And so this version, I was kind of returning to the sort of earlier question of like, how do we deal with these mismatches in both scale and also political agency? And so the idea was that this particular county in red here, Portage County, had maybe decided that it made sense to sort of alter its topography, introduce a spillway. The spillway routes enough water towards the Lake Erie side of the county to support 100,000 people. Obviously at the expense of everybody who lives on the other side of the county, which has had that amount of water removed from it. And basically it's a sort of 500-foot wide and 5-foot tall giant asphalt ridge. So it just sort of takes the high point and shifts it 500 feet into the other side of the watershed. And the expedition, what I was trying to figure out is like, how would you even deal with a project like this, which is kind of anti-public? And how would you, as an architect charged with making a better public, how would you even start? So the idea is first, these kind of maps about, damage, increased runoff levels, houses, structures that are at risk, location of bioswales, the removal of impervious surface, the red hatch on the streets on the Lake Erie side of the watershed border would all be removed and replaced with something that would be, a non-impervious surface to sort of keep the water where it wants to go. but also how, these things could be sort of coordinated into a sort of, county-wide, like 30-mile stretch of public spaces. So introducing, sports facilities, shelter, these kind of super graphics to sort of point out, where areas of, danger during a storm might be. Also, what are the specific, kind of bring this full circle back to the Singapore project. How do, architectural tools have to conform this? So I almost exclusively used the sort of parallel projection tool as a sort of method of showing things at a very great distance at a legible scale. And then most notably, working with this 1 to 500, 1 foot equals 500 foot model of the spillway itself, which was the kind of centerpiece of the gallery. The idea being this was a kind of study model for the office and a sort of tool of identifying, areas of risk. And it's, again, distorted because these are very, 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 very small differences. So it had to be scaled in the Z-axis by a factor of 30. Oops, sorry. So again, sorry, that probably went a little long, but to conclude, so I consider these kind of the beginnings of maybe a sort of attempt to answer a slightly more fundamental question, in my opinion, which is, again, what is the future of architecture in a world where, maybe a sort of ground up building is not only, more expensive, but also possibly unethical, if not completely impossible given, scarcity and the sort of impacts of climate change. So maybe I'll leave it at that end on a high note, but thank you again.
Thank you, Galen. Okay.
Great. Thank you to all the presenters. Those are really fantastic presentations and very inspiring work that's happening all across the country. Felipe, do you want to jump in or do you want me to jump in?
Maybe I'll start with that because I have a very general question.
Sure.
So maybe I'll put mine out first and then we can build from that. But I think maybe it's a question in two parts, or maybe two questions. We'll see. The first one for me has to do with disciplinary knowledge. First of all, a great collection of presentations and an evening where I've learned a lot. So thank you from all the presentations. The first question that I would have has to do with sort of discipline, the framing of the discipline. Because many of you, first of all of you work at a very large scale. You're all claiming a very large scale within your work, which of course I'm not going to oppose. I embrace that. Second, all of you are drawing techniques from different disciplines, right? So many of you are trained as architects and are sort of working within the realm of architecture, but building from certain techniques of landscape architecture, others that come from physical and environmental planning, others that actually might be outside of techniques that are outside of the realm of design. And maybe the first question that I would have to all of you is, what is the relationship between your education, the training that you received, and the work that you're developing? And where do you see sort of the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, moving sort of influencing your work, maybe less as a collection of silos and more as a larger unified disciplinary body? So I wonder if you could first sort of speak a little bit about the relationship maybe between sort of how you frame the discipline and then how your work fits or doesn't within those boundaries. And if nobody wants to go first, I'll choose someone.
Well, I guess I can jump in. Let me try to answer this. I mean, I guess where I see it coming from my own experience is, well, I had a life before going to get my master's. that was not architectural. I was working in DC. I had started my undergraduate as a fine arts major. I then switched to political science because well, it's a long story, but anyway, I was not working in architecture. And I have to say what struck me recently is sort of like when I started my master's, it felt like we were kind of at the tail end of maybe a period where the politics of architecture was sort of detached, I'll say, and sort of there was a kind of irony and critical distance. I'm trying to be very careful about how I say this. And I also don't want to name names about which office I think is behind this, but anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I think now we're at a point where I think that sort of framing, in my opinion, was sort of a kind of like schizophrenic like split. Like you were your person and you were an entity in a political system, but then you were an architect, which put you in a sort of different position relative to that political system, and that sort of detached you from the consequences. And I think, at least how I try to think about myself is not as an architect first and then anything else. I think it's rather, and I think, working around, climate change, climate catastrophe, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you kind of have to reconcile two parts of yourself. There's the thing that you do, and there's the way that you as an individual kind of interact with, systems and things that maybe, are larger than you. And so, I would say as what I try to think I'm doing is not taking the easy position, which is maybe to sort of, do the ironic project and not have to like care about, I don't know, conscience, I guess. But really try to like, think earnestly about, what the greater good is. How do we sort of satisfy maybe ambitions about like scale of a project or the kind of new, keep them interesting for us as architects, but also, actually genuinely try to like make a positive impact and sort of, introduce a new kind of understanding of the world into the discipline. I don't know if I've been successful, but I think that's sort of an emerging, I think, trend, which I think is great. And I mean, I see it also in Felipe and Neeraj and in your work as well, where it's like, it's not, it's not ironic, it's not detached. It's like, it's speculative, but it's speculative from a place where it's, I don't know, positive, empathetic, trying to deal with things in a very earnest and in a very real way. And I certainly saw that with the other three presentations here as well. So I don't know, maybe I'll stop there before I piss off anybody.
That raises a lot of other questions. But before we go to those other questions, we'll let maybe some of the other people speak.
Okay. I think I can jump in now. So I have a very similar sort of starting point, I think, as Galen mentioned, about not sort of finding your place when I graduated in after my undergrad in architecture. I was very much focused and determined to be an architect, and I was checking all the boxes and all of that. And I had an opportunity to work in Nepal for a summer. For 4 months to design and build a school. So it was a very clear brief. I had to go there, work with the community and design and build a school. And really, I think that's the point when I started diverging from architecture, because I realized that the tools that I had couldn't really sort of begin to analyze or understand the changes that were happening in rural Nepal. And so this project actually emerges from a decade-long experience of like having witnessed sort of the impacts of urbanization in rural communities, and initially not really being able to understand what is my role. Should I just focus on designing and building a structure, or you know, is there something else? And that's actually what led me to the master's in at Oxford Brookes, which is focused on Indigenous communities and participatory design and working in developing countries. And so constantly I was trying to, you know, raise my hand and ask, what is the role of architecture and design in all of this? I think now, having gone through like a trajectory of, doing work in the field, I'm really trying to come back into architecture and sort of think about multi-species design, because we are, as I believe everyone has mentioned, like we are in the Anthropocene. We do need to think about how do we create, spaces not just for humans, but non-human species as well. And so I think now I've come back sort of to that particular interest, and I do think that there is a contribution that our field can make in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just jump in also quickly to say, well, first, thank you, Felipe, for the question. I completely agree, actually, with most of what Galen and Priyanka have put on the table. I mean, the idea, of course, that we're I don't know if most of us, if not all of us, were sort of probably in architecture school at some point, sort of wondering, well, what about the world? What's going on out there, and how do we fix it or do something about it? I think for me, going back to your question, Felipe, on the relationship between our education or training and, again, the work that we're developing, I actually studied architecture for undergrad and for graduate school. And yet before that, I had like 2 years of a biomedical engineering background, which is where, again, I think a lot of the notions or maybe interests on biology and ecology and so many things that are recurring in my work, I think start to seep in. And in architecture, in Cornell, in my undergrad, I was really focused on just dealing with sort of urban traumas very broadly, which I thought to be simply urban issues, urban problems that the discipline of architecture, as opposed to urban design, for example, could fix, again, at a smaller or granular scale, or even at a large scale, but through multiple architectural scaled interventions. And I think that work, as soon as I went into grad school after, I realized what larger trauma might there be today than climate crisis, and again, environmental uncertainty, and all of these things that are on the table. And again, for me, architecture is about space, but also about experience and place and the movement of bodies in such spaces and places, and so on. So in a way, it's about livability. And I think this is where I started formulating this notion that also my fellow fellows have talked about, the idea that perhaps architecture is not just even for humans, but that there are other constituencies, peoples, we could say not necessarily human in the world, that might also benefit from, if not an architecture, from being taken into account when producing architectures. So I think that's sort of where I situate my work and myself today. And I think it's interesting every time I think back at grad school and undergrad, and I think, why didn't I ever go for like a Master of Urban Design, for example, if you want to talk about scale. But I do think, again, that there is something about the architectural practice and architectural knowledge, and specifically architectural education, that actually allows you to really set your foot on many different grounds and basically apply our techniques to many different purposes. So yeah, I think that's how it operates for me, at least.
Yeah, I think all of these responses are so fascinating, also to get to know the kind of complete personhood that people have outside of just their training and kind of how they approach things. So I really appreciate the question. I think for me, I mean, understanding that also, my discipline isn't architecture, and so this kind of expanded kind of thinking of discipline is helpful here. But also, I think, after my master's in landscape architecture, have now moved into my doctoral work is in human geography, and so there's also a cross-disciplinary work happening there. And part of that reason that I think I want to bring up, I think there's two real reasons as to why I was sensing that maybe the design disciplines as a kind of expanded disciplinary body, I wasn't necessarily able to ask the questions at the scales that I wanted to ask them at, but also thinking about, there's two things that come up for me. One is questions of methods. I find in the design disciplines, although there are methods that we use, they are not methodical. They're just things that we go about doing and practices that we learn through and are extremely important to creative practice. But when it comes to kind of really deeply understanding the operation of power and really big systemic issues, sometimes reaching out to other disciplines to engage with a methodology that's maybe more developed and more developed in a rigorous way is actually really quite helpful for understanding the kind of many layers that need to be understood in more systemic issues. And then the other one, I mean, deeply related to that is, I think, and this comes back to what Galen was talking about before I wrap up, is although architecture maybe in this present moment and architecture and design disciplines in this present moment are more concerned with politics than they were even when I was doing my graduate work in the disciplines, they don't have that long tradition of engaging with politics in the way that many, many other disciplines do. And I think therefore this kind of need to reach out to critical race theorists, environmental people that do environmental humanities, people that do human geography, like all of these other disciplines that have a long-standing tradition of working with the kind of multifaceted political questions that we're faced with. It's a really important thing to kind of engage with. And I think that, so for me, it's those questions of this disciplinary lineage that other disciplines maybe have been working on for a very long time, as opposed to the kind of trends that I sense in design disciplines often come and go, maybe faster. And then the other one around methods, but I'll leave it there, and I'm sure there's other things to talk about, or we'll come back to this.
Yeah, thanks. No, this raises a lot of, I think, other questions, but we'll maybe have Neeraj come into the conversation, and then I'll leave my second question for the end.
Well, I really appreciate your question as well, Felipe, because I think I heard that question a lot during my fellowship of why architecture, why the architect, and I think it's a really important question to keep asking yourself, because I think there's many tools that we have in our disposal, and one of those that I saw in all four presentations were the tools of representation. And when I'm talking about representation here, I'm going to define it in two ways. One is, who do we represent as architects? And I think all of the kind of presentations expand the subject of who we represent. What do we represent? And this is kind of getting into kind of questions of both content, but also ethics and morals. And I think there's kind of a assumed understanding of making the world a better place, but all of you have very different subjects and different forms of content that you're tackling. And then the other half of the question of representation, which is how do we see? A lot of these projects are trying to see things in ways that we can't see, we didn't see before. And so there's questions of visualization and modeling. I think, Galen, you talked a bit more directly to this in some of your work. But also, and as Zannah, in your project, in your presentation, you used the term the hegemonic ways of seeing, going beyond these hegemonic ways of seeing, which implicate, maybe new techniques of drawing, new techniques of modeling. So I guess I'm curious, A, how you landed on your subjects and your contents, and B, how have you thought about the disciplinary tools of drawing and modeling as a way of opening up a conversation to see differently?
Should we go in the same order?
I didn't know if I broke up because my internet has been coming in. Did everyone hear me? Okay, just checking.
Sure, yeah, I would go the same order. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think to answer the question about how I arrived at this, I mean, I want to be very clear. I don't, I see this sort of question of seeing and the sort of lenses that we put on. I mean, I will be the first to tell you that I don't think I'm, completely anywhere yet, really. I mean, I think it may just be impossible. I mean, I think, as Zannah, like you were saying, I think there are things that, need to be done by other experts, just the same way we, send, we don't build the buildings ourselves, we hire the contractors, right? Like it's a sort of similar thing, but it doesn't mean, we can't learn from them. But I mean, I've always been very interested in this idea of, I don't know. I mean, I think, again, like not to go back to sort of where I started in the discipline, but I think there was still, even at GSEP in the sort of late Mark Wigley years when I joined, there was still a sort of idea about the right way that you're supposed to talk about the political side of architecture, and it was always kind of outward facing, as in like, you could design a political building, but it was, something civic or bureaucratic or, or it was just sort of like an evidently public space, like a, like a mall, or no, not a mall, like the National Mall, like a sort of grand open space. And, I guess I kind of took that as a sort of challenge. I mean, again, just sort of thinking about, again, it's not so much that we as architects have to sort of, swoop in and solve politics, but rather I think we need to learn from the moment about like how our discipline is political, and how, there are internal dynamics within the discipline that we could reconcile. There are these kind of, I think for better or for worse, there's certainly a stigma around like the kind of work that is like public work. In my professional career, I worked for an office that did a lot for the DDC here in New York. And there was definitely, I felt, a sort of classism, I guess, about the sort of architects who worked for the DDC, who, got to go home at 5 and had benefits and, but they weren't, designers, they were like the bureaucrats that helped you get the project along. And I kind of, the early phases of the Great Lakes Project were definitely more about like kind of taking that on directly and sort of saying, no, like architecture needs more bureaucracy and it needs more of a like broader portfolio of things that it has to deal with. And like, how do you sort of glamorize that to the same way that, any good architecture office is also glamorized. I mean, I think there's nothing inherently better, I guess, in my opinion, there's nothing inherently better about, a sort of single practice versus something that maybe is the scale of the DDC, like hundreds of people. And so I suppose that was sort of the beginning of it, like just really trying to think about, what, maybe before we try to fix the world, what is like within our world right now as architects, and what can we fix, and how might that lead to sort of a different kind of project and a different kind of outcome.
Yeah, I thought that was really powerful in your presentation, Galen. I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit more on some of the choices, in your exhibitions, really amazing models and mappings, just some of the choices of how to translate your project into these techniques that, are much more disciplinary, and how you landed on those choices.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think to be totally honest, I'm still kind of sorting that out. I mean, these things happen very, very fast. So apologies if this is a little incoherent, but I mean, the model I think is a big challenge. I mean, I think not that it's easier, but I think, the sort of theoretical drawing has always been a kind of standby for a lot of, architects who are very public-minded. I mean, like, Michael Sorkin is more famous for his drawings than for the models of, the weird little houses that he designed, right? Even though the sort of ethos of those things was sort of, in my mind, kind of similar. And I guess, well, yeah, there's a sort of narrow version, which is, I mean, I'm here in New York. Our shop at GSAP could have, there were 3 of those wood shops would have fit in the Ohio State Gallery. So the first was sort of like, oh my God, like I have so much more space than I did, the month before I got here. But then really, I think, the medium of the model and the architectural model, I think I particularly like, and I'm not going to take full credit for this. Somebody actually from a different discussion was telling me this. But it is this sort of public-facing aspect of architectural production. I mean, an architectural drawing can be read by somebody who's not an architect, but it generally takes some steps. You have to understand drawing conventions, you have to understand dashed lines, the overhead, the door swing. Like there are weird things, and that's just the sort of the basic, not even like a drawing set, right? Whereas a model, I think, is very tangible. I mean, I think there's a reason why Frank Lloyd Wright did Broadacre City as a literal model the size of a room. I mean, I think there's like an importance of scale, and there's an importance of tactility that you can't get with a drawing in the same way. So, I took that on as a challenge. I mean, especially since the Singapore project I felt was too much paper, and I still am struggling with how to even make that physical. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of how I put it. I mean, I think it's a sort of, as you were saying, there's like a synergy, I think, between the sort of assumption of what public architecture looks like, but also how it's kind of represented. And to me, I thought this was a good way to sort of take those both on directly.
Anybody else want to address this question?
Yeah, I can jump in also. Thanks, Neeraj, for the question. I mean, the question of representation is actually, I think, a really great one, because you're right that I think in all of our projects, explicitly or implicitly, it was certainly a thing we had to deal with. How do we show this? How do we visualize it? How do we understand it? It's even almost developing ways to see those things in the first place that also matters a lot. I think one interesting thing for me teaching at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the fact that my first semester I had to coordinate and teach the foundation studio made me not run away from the conventions of drawing, for example, and the conventions of models and how to do certain things the way we're supposed to do them, or the way that they are done. But also to use those moments as opportunities to also introduce variations, and to ask students, aside from, let's say, just drawing a wall and understanding line weight and thickness, also understanding how they might also have agency to draw things that are invisible, like weather, or making simple tweaks. Like, for example, in that same studio that I'm talking about, I posited animal species as the client for the architectural provocation, and thus just a simple shift like that made students need to not only draw the animals and understand their proportions and dimensions, but also accommodate the spaces for the usability of such animals, which in turn taught them a lesson of thinking and designing ecologically. In the same sense, for models, for example, I was interested in having students develop models that would simulate fluctuating conditions of temperature, atmospheric pressure, seas, ice formations, tectonic plates, and so on. Because again, if the architectural model serves as a way of sort of representing, but also studying certain conditions, I thought, well, these need not be static, for example. And so I think that to me was an important shift, like how to use the architectural tools, but also tweak them and modify them in a way that is actually quite productive. And then thirdly, I also, and this is something I wish I had been able to show you, my first stabs at putting this presentation together, it was full of videos, which is how I like to present normally. But because of the time constraint, there was no time to actually look at any of the videos. So I thought I'd just put stills. But videos were a major representation technique that was employed not just by me, but also by all of my students. And the idea was, again, to try to represent fluctuating conditions, to try to represent time, to try to represent change. And well, here we are now, all through Zoom, all the time, which has proved then, for which videos, for example, have actually proved very good, actually, for modulating conversations, discussions, etc. So yeah, I think those are the sort of three main auguries of how my work got shown or studied or produced, that I just add to on the table here.
I could maybe jump in quickly on, oh, sorry, Priyanka.
Go ahead.
But okay, is I think, so for me, the kind of how to arrive at the, seeing differently or seeing in the first place, and that part of representation, landscape as a term, and there's debate over this, but landscape as a term is seen as inherently or defined as a way of seeing. And that, I think, it's so strongly established within the discipline, both within landscape studies, but also within the discipline of landscape architecture, that landscape itself is visual. As a historical way of kind of understanding landscape, that's very significant. And then when you dive into the history of it, and thinking about Dennis Cosgrove and others that have done amazing work on this, you dive into the history of it, you realize how deeply flawed that is, and that it's bourgeois, elitist, used for the control of power, or the control of landscape through a position of power, sometimes in the prospect, or there's deep gender connotations to it. There's just so many layers to that actual act of seeing that then forms landscape that to me anyway, it seemed impossible to be studying landscapes that are the sites of so many layers of colonization and racialization and internal colonization, without engaging with those kind of the ways that landscapes have been constructed visually, and those kind of processes that exist on them. I think then, though, there's these questions about like, how do you change it? And I do think that within landscape scholarship, and maybe this is not just landscape, there has been this kind of what I think some have called the embodied turn, the move to, okay, well, if visuality is so problematic that it can't be kind of looked at in any other way, then maybe we need to move to embodiment and how bodies exist in space. And I think that work is really, really valuable. But for me, one of the reasons why I continue to both critique visuality, but also try to kind of push into new ways of seeing or into new ways of visually representing landscape, is because it's one of those traditions that it's not going to go away. Although yes, we do experience landscape as bodies, and I think that that's very important work. Understanding the lineage of the visual landscape tradition is, I think, really, really important to critiquing it, and then also having some new forms of visuality to directly contest the continued production of landscape visuality that gets, it's like the shiny renderings, but it's also just, so visual in terms of the world that we live in. And so having something that can directly, and this is where the kind of term counter visuality, which is not my term, comes from, is really important as a way of contesting that visuality, instead of just kind of shying away from it in general. And so I think understanding that through the lens of landscape is really important. And it's, there's ways of approaching it, and it has been approached for a long time. Once you start digging into that history, you realize like, oh yeah, there have been really wonderful examples of that throughout the history of landscape visuality as well. So I think for me, that's been really important to understand, and that I think has always happened in my research, where maybe I'll start studying power explicitly, and how that operates in these kind of more hegemonic ways, and then realizing that there's always been resistance to power, and the deeper that you look, you'll find these other histories of resistance to it, and you just kind of have to stick with it, however problematic and sticky the topic is, like representation and seeing. But Priyanka, I cut you off, so.
No worries. That was very well put together. I think in terms of my own work, I don't believe that visually is as perhaps developed or as well put together. However, there are two things that I think are important. One is, as I believe Galen mentioned, about making, or José mentioned, making the invisible visible, and sort of understanding, the non-human counterparts. And that's what we did in the studio as well, start to understand the proportions of different species. And in terms of the master plan that we developed, it was very much an interest, in terms of our team and the communities also to make biodiversity, the kind of center of the conversation, and with the audience of government stakeholders in mind. The other part, actually, which is very important, is also in terms of representation, is that we focus a lot on who documents the information rather than what is documented. And I work in particular with young people from rural communities, young women, from really marginalized backgrounds, to give them the tools, a camera, iPad, mostly that's what attracts them actually to get into conservation, and give them the skills to start to map, to document, to record videos. And we have a library of 100 indigenous knowledge videos that have been documented by the indigenous young people, from the landscape. And so I think part of, and 80% of my presentation, all the photographs were taken by Ganga Limbu, who's our first youth fellow in our project. And so those are the two, I guess, aspects that I want to mention in this conversation. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Priyanka. I think, of course, all this raises a lot of different questions, but we also want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So maybe we open questions to the public, and then if there's time, Neeraj and I will go back to some of these points. So if people have questions, you can either type them or just go ahead and sort of unmute and speak. Okay, while people are, oh, we have one. Where?
Hey guys.
Galen.
Great presentations, everyone. Super enlightening work. I just have a really quick question, maybe around an idea of maybe epistemology, maybe meaning that I think we've seen this kind of come up time and again, right? So history kind of operates in cycles. Sometimes architecture gets more political, and then it sort of like leaves, the politics leave, and then people get a little bit more introverted, and then the politics coming up again. And then it recedes again. So it's almost as if the political and architecture seems to come in waves. The last wave maybe that we can identify is the kind of research that OMA/AMO were doing in the sort of early 2000s, dealing with sort of post 9/11 crisis and oil crisis and et cetera, right? And so I'm wondering if this is just kind of inevitable, if your work is maybe reactionary in that sense, and if you can position it as part of this lineage of kind of up and down political, let's say, interest. Because I heard Galen talk a little bit more about a moral imperative or an ethical imperative, but I think that that's also been brought up, historically, right? You can see it from the 1960s when there was a kind of a political project that then waned in the sort of 80s, right? And so I just wanted to bring up maybe the issue of history and see if anybody has any opinion on that, or if I'm just totally kind of out there.
I mean, maybe I'll jump in really quickly, and other people can jump in as well, especially since I don't bring the kind of architectural history background to this. But I do think, I mean, the question that you asked is this kind of inevitable that the political will come and go within architecture? I think it's likely inevitable. And I know that there's also a question about the grind of corporate capitalism in the chat. It's likely that architecture as a discipline and a practice that is wrapped up in corporate capitalism, that there will be trends and that things will come and go, because that's how capitalism marches forward and makes us buy things and throw them out and buy them again. So yes, it's inevitable that there will be trends in kind of architecture and what is trendy will come and go. That being said, I think perhaps other disciplines, and you know, maybe it doesn't even necessarily come down to disciplines. I think other disciplines, or for some people, it isn't something to be trendy because it's a lived experience every day. Politics, there is no kind of privilege to come and go from experiencing politics. So for some people that experience the kind of negative impacts of the politics that we all seem to care about today, that has never not existed for them. And it's never not been in their face. And I think for those people and for the people that work in the discipline on that stuff, I don't think that it's inevitable that that comes and goes. I actually think that there can be a continued pressure, and that actually there has been a kind of continued pressure, and it comes back to a little bit what I was saying about resistance, where if you look hard enough, there's always been a resistance or a counterculture or a way of people kind of engaging with that. And so I think being aware of that, and particularly when we're kind of looking at the history with the capital H and just looking at, you know, what's gone back and forth in the top trending of history, yeah, you might see more fluctuation there, but I think you can kind of see these really, really persistent resistance to hegemony, or you know, whatever it is, however you want to define it throughout. And I think that that's an important thing to kind of talk about when talking about the discipline, because it becomes just this kind of like amorphous, who is the discipline and who makes up that discipline, I think is also kind of questions that come into that. But I'm sure other people have kind of more disciplinary knowledge as well that can jump in.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, I don't have very much to add to that. I thought that was really great. Because I mean, yeah, I definitely hear you, Gala, with the moral question. And I guess the sort of, well, obviously, I mean, yeah, I should go without saying, like, morals have been used to defend literally everything in architectural production. And I guess what to me seems different, and I think this builds off Zannah's point, is that, and again, this is entirely my opinion, but it seems like there's a difference between the sort of politics of like self-architect, which I would sort of lump, which is where I would kind of lump, you know, Rem and obviously like Philip Johnson, Korb, Frank Lloyd Wright, like that sort of conflation of like the personal architectural project with the sort of specific morality of that architect's like perceived, you know, what they think is like the best future. And to me, I think there is this kind of undercurrent. I mean, one of the things that I really was like, and I've been thinking about a lot actually over the summer, is like the history of these sort of like community-based design groups, which used to be quite prevalent and are not, but not because architects moved away from them, but because of sort of, you know, Reagan, to put it plainly, like the Reagan era cuts to the sort of funding sources that those groups had used to remain viable. So I think, well, on the one hand, I'm not trying to like excuse, you know, architects from pursuing, you know, personal vanity projects. And I certainly, you know, I think that the politicality of those projects certainly does kind of come and go based on like what's in vogue and what's a reaction to that. But I do think there's, to me, I think the bigger thing here, and what I hope is the outcome of some of these like questions about climate and questions about, you know, these sort of like supply chain, like kind of embodied costs that I think, you know, a lot of people are talking about, and I think all three of us, the other three of us today has kind of touched on, is that there's like a systematic response to these things that architects can't do, but we can know, but if we know what to ask for, and we know like how we can sort of be advocates for those sort of structural changes that I think would help at least like kind of build sustainability into the system. I think that to me seems like the sort of worthwhile politics right now. And so, yeah, so it's not so much about the aesthetic. I mean, at least in my view, it's more about sort of understanding how we can be helpful, but also understanding that we can't do it alone, and sort of that there is precedent for, you know, yeah, structural support for architects trying to do good, quote unquote. You can't see the air quotes, but if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't have much to add either, Gallo. I'm just gonna say maybe the answer to your question is yes. It is a trend in a way. Architecture does get more political at times and less political at other times. So indeed, this is sort of the spirit of time we're in currently. Is your question also perhaps, are the projects earnest? Like, are you actually interested in ecologies and infrastructure and things like that? And I think that's also probably arguable or also very different for all of us. Again, I think I try to also be very honest earlier, for example, stating that I have been interested in sort of the problems of the urban, of the city, let's say, and how architecture can work to either remedy, resolve them, work with them, use them as opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, maybe this is very personal. It might be grounded on the fact that I'm from Venezuela, where there was always an urban crisis. And my work now has taken a shift toward ecological thinking, and not now, for the last years. I think, again, precisely because I see that as this sort of impending thing to tackle. And in that case, I think the project is very earnest. Might it change or evolve? Yeah, I totally hope so.
But
I think sorry, go ahead. Just, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So just in terms of trends and, following trends and also my own interest in trends, I think in terms of my project and the work that we're doing, the field actually decides, what's going to work and what's not going to work. And so you can have this amazing idea, and that's really incredible. And when actually implementing it on the ground, it may not have any sort of reach or any success. And so just recently, Nepal completely changed into from a centralized government went to federalism, which in theory is a very good and important move. But in terms of the environmentalists, like us, being stuck in that, it's actually quite troubling. So actually, in terms of, there are theories and trends and that we need to exist in, but I think in terms of our project in particular, it's really the field determines, what's going to work and what's not. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, Priyanka, I'm glad you went first, because we were thinking along the same lines. And one issue that I was going to sort of put on the table is that in many ways, architecture and design becomes most political when it carries the weight of implementation, right? When things have to be sort of put in the field and sort of it becomes contested, and where multiple stakeholders actually have a say, and so on. And perhaps a question in regards to that I would have to sort of to all of you, but I think that it applies maybe more specifically to Galen's work, but actually no, all four, is where do you actually see the relationship between larger sort of examination, which a lot of your work does, right? It maps, it visualizes. What are those scales? And then where do you see the precise scale of intervention? And those don't necessarily need to match, right? The examination might be at a territorial scale. The implementation might be the design of a backpack, right? That addresses that territorial scale, that helps you navigate that territorial scale. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about sort of examination and sort of an approach to implementation in your work. And we won't start with Galen this time.
Well, maybe I can jump in, because it also speaks a little bit to Emily Scott's point in the chat, which I think is an interesting one, which is that the focus on infrastructure, this kind of idea of the focus on infrastructure, although, and obviously my work focuses on infrastructure, although at once it's a very large piece of infrastructure, this highway is massive. And in fact, I didn't even get into the fact that it's a second Pan-American highway in some ways. So there's this large understanding of infrastructure that needs to be, mapped or otherwise understood at the territorial scale. But then actually once you, and I think the most exciting critical scholars of infrastructure right now, once they engage with infrastructure, you realize quite quickly that although it might be made up of a really extensive set of relations that do extend across a huge amount of territory, it is actually about these very local and kind of smaller scale sites of intervention, and in some ways, each moment along the highway or each little segment of highway is so, has so many ecological implications, but also the kind of politics around it. And so a lot of my time is spent in the archives, and in each bridge, there'll be all of these petitions going back and forth about the bridge, and these are like historic documents. And that those actually are very much at, they're maybe even at a site scale that is too small for a lot of people to be excited about it in terms of an intervention. It'll be a bridge over a very, very small, little tiny canyon. So I think that to me is a really interesting way of understanding particularly infrastructure. And I think that one of the reasons why I study infrastructure is because although I'm interested in the large scale, I'm also interested in, the impact that these large systems have on individual people. And I think, to me anyway, that one of the reasons I came into the study of infrastructure is because actually the scholars working on it, I feel, have really nailed down this idea of scalable relations that do end up coming into these sites of intervention that can be super, super contentious. Or even, there's like this one particular site that I think of a lot, which is where the Jeeps themselves, to get through that really muddy patch of road, where the Jeeps themselves are these like hubs of a conversation about the failure of the state and all of these kind of conversations that happen at, where all of the Jeeps are coming and going. And those then start to really feel like both a design scale, but also a scale that really gets at the impacts of these larger systems on, maybe people care about different things that I'm not kind of getting into, but I do think, for me anyway, a deep care about people and the impacts that these systems have on people is really why I do the work that I do. And you do end up finding that while on the highway, because you're always kind of existing at the scale of a person, even though you have to think about it at the scale of an infrastructure. So I'll let other people jump in on that as well. I'm sure there's different answers for everybody's kind of work.
I think in terms of my work in particular, like everything actually has to be implemented and tested to see if it's worth even exploring in terms of research. And the initial idea 4 or 5 years ago that we started with was actually thinking about how indigenous people can actually work in conservation, and this was also something that I didn't think was possible, but until I met some indigenous people, farmers, fisher folks, who were absolutely passionate about conservation. And so I think in terms of my work in particular, like we really need to, there's the larger sort of macro, vertical university scale that sort of is kind of, I guess, tries to unite in a way this project, but at a deeper level, like there are people on the ground, hundreds of people actually working and sort of developing their own sort of versions of the project, and whether it's documenting indigenous knowledge or protecting yellow-breasted bunting or whatnot. And the thing that I think even in terms of architecture, like we still also need to start experimenting with the communities about the human and non-human design. And so I started that, before COVID hit, this Being a Bird workshop with the community members to see, whether there would be any interest. There is a great deal of interest, and to get to the next phase of, okay, let's develop, a cladding that, or a structure that that combines the two stakeholders. Yeah, that's what I want to mention.
Well, first of all, Priyanka, I'm super jealous that you actually get to like produce these things. I mean, that's sort of, Felipe, I guess kind of to answer your question, I mean, that it's a frustration of mine personally that I'm still trying to sort out. I mean, because to sort of pick up on what Zannah and Priyanka have said, I mean, what was really fascinating about the Great Lakes in particular was the sort of, there was the initial kind of discovery of the sort of politics around the Foxconn factory, which sort of unlocked the whole region as this sort of concern. But I mean, all of that journalism was pretty grassroots around Foxconn. I mean, it was very, I think there was a very large story a few months ago I forget where, that was sort of detailing the saga, but that news was 3 years old at this point. And I guess a part of what struck me the most actually was as I was driving home from Cleveland on Sunday, I actually, they actually do have these signs on I-80 as you're leaving Ohio driving east, and it tells you when you're entering or leaving the Great Lakes watershed. And so I think, and maybe this is a trite answer, but one of the things, because I didn't have anything to do with this, but certainly one of the ways in which there is this kind of cultural and infrastructural network that does have quite a bit of scale to it is these sort of, in the Great Lakes, it's the lakes and the watersheds themselves. I mean, there was a story about, people in upstate New York who are being affected because, Canadian shipping conglomerates need to hold more water in Lake Ontario. And so it's eroding their coastline. And yet, when you read the newspaper stories, they interview these people and they understand exactly what like the International Joint Commission is, and they understand why the water is higher, and they understand why it's being done, and they understand that it's not, because of them, right? Like that something is happening to them, and they kind of, I think what it definitely reminded me of, and what I keep trying to remind myself of, is that this is very real. And I mean, to sort of loop back, I mean, so yeah, part of why it's sort of, I wish there was an opportunity to actually build something out of these things like physical, is because I think there is a very particular conversation that happens around actually making something work to the point where, to a different point rather than say with Singapore. I mean, it's kind of an information system. Like there are many ways that project could become something public facing, and I sincerely hope it does. But there's something about the kind of tactility of a system of infrastructure that has these sort of like the proper scale and the proper, I keep saying proper, what do I mean by proper? Well, like a certain scale and like a certain kind of relationship to maybe something, like a natural resource that really does have a kind of tangible impact on people's lives. I mean, so, I think within that framework, it doesn't have to be, the giant spillway model, doesn't have to be the giant scrubber thing. I mean, it really could be as simple as like, the sign on the road that just sort of points out to people, oh, right, like this is, you were 2 seconds ago in something else, and maybe you don't know what it is, but it was important enough that somebody like put up a sign on the highway.
Emily, I think we were going to say.
Hi. I know we're almost out of time, but I have a kind of specific question for Priyanka that I think resonates with some of the other topics that have come up. It's tied to this idea of kind of the field, and when you actually begin to sort of execute something on the ground, the kind of specificities that are demanded. But I was struck in your presentation about the way that it sounds like you built the geography of the university around the location of these individual activist stewards, these environmental stewards. And then I wonder, both as a way that kind of undercuts someone's earlier comment about the kind of elitism or corporate nature of academia, right? This is kind of a reverse model. But then whether or not in the Nepalese context where you're working, if those people have been sort of increasingly endangered or precarious as environmental kind of frontline activists have been all over the world, like with rising numbers of murders of kind of frontline defenders of land and water, this trend, if that is the case, I'm curious to know, first of all, but then second, if somehow producing a university around these individuals also has this effect of providing a level of protection of these people and what they're doing, like giving them a kind of support system of protection to keep doing their work. And so I'm curious about that kind of interplay between these individuals, any sort of precarity of their own sort of position, and how the establishment or corporation of them and their work into the university sort of adds a whole new layer to the kind of geography of kind of capitalist violence in the region, something like that. It's kind of a inarticulate, rambling question, but I hope you're understanding what I'm asking.
Thank you so much, Emily. Great to see you here. Yes, there are lots and lots of dangers. And, so I didn't talk too much about the project, and what we've done so far, but just in the last 2 years, like roads and hydropower projects, 17 hydropower projects have been stopped as a result of not our effort, but we supported, these community leaders in this high altitude region called Papung to stop hydropower, because they were also interested in protecting these areas. And as a result of that, the main leader has actually received all sorts of harassments, threats, and everything. And just recently, what we realized is also that our donor, our funder, has been sort of talking publicly about how these communities are stopping hydropower, which is not something that you don't want to explicitly talk about, because it actually ends up endangering those individuals. We always talk about the education, and learning grounds, and we're trying to build this project, supporting rural youth and in the Nepali context, because it is very dangerous. And recently we've also had to decide, not to maybe pursue funding that is publicly going to be disclosing, these things, although, it may be happening. We just can't sort of speak about it openly. And that's something that I feel, that it is very important to understand. And yeah. So we've been really, really, really incredibly lucky to have met these individuals who are interested in doing the work that they're doing. But now I think in terms of the next phase of the project, we're being really, really careful to make sure that they're not exposed, but that we do the work without actually talking about it too much. Yeah. Not sure if it answers all your questions, but.
Thank you, Emily, for the question, and Priyanka for your answer. I believe our time is coming to a close, and there's so many questions I've written down just in this conversation, but I was just thinking, if we had had this conversation 10 years ago, where there was a lot of action around infrastructure and ecology happening, so much of that boiled down to problem solving. And what's super exciting to see is that the work presented today is much more about problematizing what is happening instead of just solely problem solving. Of course, all of you have problems that you're tackling within your work, but this isn't at the forefront of the project. And it was really amazing to actually see the word empathy show up in 2 of the presentations as one of the major goals of the project, of how do we put ourselves into the shoes of others, human and non-human, and take that on as a discipline. And I think this is a really powerful way to think about the urban project, and even the role of the architect, of the designers of the kind of framework and the conditions to allow for empathy. If we had more time, I would love to learn more about how you do that with your students, how you make them empathetic, how you allow them to see new things, but this will hopefully be continued over drinks in real life, not in a grid.
Yes, I think we can sort of say that drinks are due in Charlottesville in the future. I agree with Neeraj that there's a great degree of sort of framing a great degree of sophistication in the way in which I think all of you frame a problem, frame a set of arguments. And what at least I found fascinating, in addition to sort of the specifics of the presentation, is that I think in all of you, there's a project that doesn't end today or didn't end at the end of the fellowship, but it's something that will continue to develop for the next 5 years, for the next decade, and it's integral to your life. And all I can say is that I look forward, hopefully, to be able to host at UVA in 5 or 10 years, the sequel to this, and to actually see where all of these projects are have gone and have evolved. Thank you to the 4 of you for great presentations. Thank you, Neeraj, for joining us. It had been a while, but Neeraj and I go way back. It's good to have you here, even if it's in a small grid today. And with that, I'll pass the microphone back to Katie and Kyle.
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you, Neeraj, for moderating this great discussion, and to all of the fellows for really, I think, thought-provoking work and a lot of commonalities, maybe the most commonalities of any of the nights we've seen so far, which is kind of exciting. Thank you to everyone, and Kyle will share some information on next week.
So we hope that everyone can join us again next week for the final event of the Projecting Fellows series. The session will be themed Modes of Practice, and presenting fellows will be Menatala Ahmed-Aga, Matisse Gross-Kaufmanis, Eduardo Mediero, Amelin Ning, and Hans Tursek. And we're excited to have the session moderated by Aaron Bessler and Sekou Cook. So we hope you can all join us again next week for the last session at the same time. Thanks, everyone.